In the quiet hum of a city that never sleeps, there was a man named Elias, whose days were a blur of deadlines and demands. He worked in a towering glass building, his desk a fortress of papers and screens, each one whispering urgency. Elias was good at what he did: numbers, projections, strategies, but the weight of it all pressed against his chest, a silent ache that followed him home. At night, when the world stilled, he would sit on his balcony, staring at the stars, wondering why his success felt so hollow. He had everything he was told to chase, yet peace slipped through his fingers like sand. One evening, as the city's lights flickered below, Elias found himself remembering a story his grandmother once told him, a tale from the Buddha's teachings. It was about a merchant who carried a heavy load across a desert, refusing to set it down even as his strength waned. The merchant believed the load was his wealth, his identity, his purpose. But when he finally collapsed, exhausted, a wise traveler passed by and said, "What you carry owns you as much as you own it." Elias let those words linger, their meaning curling like smoke around his thoughts. Was he, like the merchant, clinging to burdens he didn't need to carry? The idea of karma, Elias realized, wasn't just about actions and consequences. It was about the truths we tell ourselves, the stories we believe. He had always thought of truth as a beacon, something to chase and hold high. But what if the truths he clung to, that he must always achieve, always prove himself, were trapping him in a cycle of striving and suffering? In the stillness of that night, he began to see that his restlessness wasn't caused by his work or his world, but by the way he held on to these ideas as if they defined him. Elias decided to walk a different path, if only for a moment. The next morning, instead of diving into his emails, he sat quietly with his coffee, letting the warmth of the cup ground him. He asked himself, what is true right now? Not the truth of his ambitions or his fears, but the truth of the moment, the bitterness of the coffee, the softness of the morning light. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of calm, like a door creaking open. The Buddha once taught that clinging to fixed ideas creates suffering, and Elias began to wonder if letting go of his self-imposed truth might loosen the knots in his heart. This small act of pausing became a ritual. Each day, Elias carved out a few minutes to sit with himself, to notice the world without judging it. He didn't abandon his work or his responsibilities, but he started to question the stories he told himself about them. Was it true that he had to be perfect? Was it true that his worth lay in what he achieved? Slowly he began to see these as illusions, like shadows cast by a fire. The real truth, he found, was quieter, more fluid. It lived in the breath he took, in the choices he made each day. Elias's newfound practice of pausing began to ripple into other parts of his life. At work, where meetings once felt like battlegrounds, he noticed how his colleagues clung to their own truths. There was Sarah, who believed she had to outshine everyone to be valued, and Michael, who thought admitting a mistake would unravel his authority. Elias saw himself in them, how their tightly held beliefs shaped their actions, binding them to patterns they couldn't escape. He wondered if this was karma, not a cosmic ledger, but the way our choices, rooted in what we believe, weave the fabric of our lives. One afternoon, during a tense discussion about a failing project, Elias tried something new. Instead of defending his ideas or pushing harder, he listened. He let the room's voices swirl around him, noticing the fear behind Sarah's sharp words, the defensiveness in Michael's tone. When he finally spoke, he didn't argue or persuade. He asked questions, gently probing what others held as true. The room softened, and for the first time they found a solution together. Elias realized that by loosening his grip on being right, he had created space for something better to emerge. This moment reminded him of a teaching from the Buddha about the raft. A man, desperate to cross a river, builds a raft with great effort. But once he reaches the other side, he doesn't carry the raft on his back. He lets it go, grateful for its purpose, but no longer bound to it. Elias saw his beliefs as rafts useful for a time, but heavy if clung to forever. His need to always be in control, to prove his worth, was a raft he'd been carrying too long. Letting it go didn't mean abandoning his work. It meant trusting himself enough to move forward without it. Outside of work, Elias began to notice how his relationships carried their own truths. His sister Anna often called him, weighed down by her own struggles, a demanding job, a young child, a marriage stretched thin. She believed she had to do everything perfectly, or she'd fail as a mother, a wife, a person. Elias listened, not with solutions, but with presence. He shared the story of the raft, suggesting that perhaps her idea of perfection was a burden she could set down. Anna was quiet for a long time, then whispered, "I don't know how to let go." Elias didn't have an answer, but he felt that simply asking the question was a start. Each evening, as Elias sat on his balcony, he reflected on how these small shifts were changing him. He wasn't free of stress or doubt, but he was learning to see them differently. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from attachment, and Elias began to understand this not as a distant philosophy, but as a lived truth. By questioning the stories he told himself, he was loosening the threads of karma that kept him bound. He felt lighter, as if he were stepping out of a cycle he hadn't even known he was in. As weeks turned into months, Elias found himself drawn to the spaces between his thoughts, those quiet moments where the world seemed to breathe with him. He began to seek out stories and teachings, not just from the Buddha, but from other traditions that spoke to the human heart. One evening he came across a saying, "The truth you believe and cling to makes you unavailable to hear anything new." It struck him deeply, like a bell ringing in a still forest. He saw how his old truths about success, about control, had closed him off from possibilities he hadn't even imagined. This realization took root during a visit to his parents' home, a place filled with memories of love and tension. His father, a man of few words, had always believed that strength meant never showing weakness. Elias saw this belief reflected in the way his father moved through life, rigid, unyielding, even when it pushed others away. During a quiet moment over coffee, Elias shared a story from the Buddha's life, about a king who built a grand palace to shield himself from suffering, only to find that suffering lived within his own mind. His father listened, his eyes distant but softening, as if the story had stirred something long buried. Elias didn't push or preach. He simply let the story sit between them, like a seed planted in soft earth. He was learning that truth wasn't something to force upon others, but something to offer gently, trusting it would find its way. This was a lesson from the Buddha's teaching on skillful means meeting people where they are, with compassion rather than demanding they see the world as you do. Elias began to practice this in his own life, not just with his family, but with friends, colleagues, even strangers. He listened more, judged less, and found that the world opened up in unexpected ways. One day, while walking through a park, Elias met an old woman feeding pigeons. She smiled at him, her eyes bright with a quiet wisdom. They spoke for a while, and she shared a proverb. A bird does not sing because it has an answer, but because it has a song. Elias felt a warmth in those words, a reminder that life wasn't about finding one ultimate truth, but about living with openness, letting each moment sing its own song. The woman's words echoed the Buddha's teaching on impermanence, how everything changes, and how clinging to fixed truths only creates suffering. Elias carried this lesson back to his balcony, where he now spent his evenings not just reflecting, but feeling the world around him, the coolness of the air, the hum of distant traffic, the vastness of the sky. He was beginning to see karma not as a punishment, but as a teacher, showing him how his choices shaped his path. By letting go of rigid beliefs, he was creating space for new possibilities, for a life less bound by the traps of his own mind. The seasons changed, and Elias's life began to reflect the quiet transformation within him. He noticed how the city, once a maze of noise and pressure, now held moments of beauty, a child's laughter in the street, the rustle of leaves in the wind. He was learning to live with a lighter heart, not because his circumstances had changed, but because he was changing the way he met them. The Buddha's teaching on mindfulness, paying attention to the present moment without clinging or pushing away, became a guide, a way to anchor himself amid life's uncertainties. One challenge, however, lingered like a shadow. Elias had always struggled with forgiveness, especially toward himself. Years ago, he had made a choice that hurt someone he cared about, a friend named Daniel, who had trusted Elias with a shared dream, a small business they planned together. Elias, caught up in his own ambitions, had walked away, leaving Daniel to carry the weight alone. The memory still stung, a quiet guilt that surfaced in his moments of reflection. He had told himself the truth that he was too busy, too driven, to stay committed, but now he saw that truth as a trap, one that kept him bound to regret. One evening, Elias found Daniel's number in his phone and hesitated, his thumb hovering over the call button. He thought of a teaching from the Buddha about the poison of ill will, how holding on to anger or guilt harms the one who carries it. Forgiveness, the Buddha taught, was not about erasing the past, but about freeing the heart from its grip. Elias dialed the number, his voice unsteady as he spoke. Daniel was surprised, but his tone was warm, and they talked for hours, not just about the past, but about their lives now. Daniel had moved on, built a life he loved, and bore no grudge. Elias felt a weight lift, not because he was absolved, but because he had faced the truth and let it go. This act of reaching out taught Elias something deeper about karma. It wasn't just about the actions themselves, but the intentions behind them. By choosing to act with honesty and kindness, he was planting seeds for a different future, one less tangled in the cycles of pain. He began to practice this in small ways, apologizing when he was short-tempered, offering help without expecting reward, listening when he wanted to turn away. Each choice felt like a step toward freedom, a way of unraveling the knots he had tied himself. As Elias sat on his balcony that night, he felt a sense of gratitude for the journey he was on. The stars above seemed to whisper an old saying, "You cannot travel the path until you have become the path itself." He smiled, knowing he was still walking, still learning, but no longer trapped by the truths he once held so tightly. The world felt vast, and his heart, for the first time, felt ready to meet it. Elias's journey had become a quiet rhythm, a dance between the truths he once clung to and the freedom he now sought. He no longer saw life as a race to some distant goal, but as a series of moments, each one an opportunity to choose differently. The Buddha's teaching on the Eightfold Path lingered in his mind, not as a set of rules, but as a way to live with intention, to speak kindly, act with care, and see the world with clarity. This path wasn't about perfection, but about presence, about meeting each day with an open heart. One morning, as Elias walked to work, he passed a street musician playing a gentle melody on a flute. The sound wove through the city's clamor, fragile yet unbroken. Elias stopped, letting the notes wash over him, and dropped a few coins into the musician's case. The man nodded, his eyes bright with a quiet joy. In that moment, Elias felt a connection, not just to the musician, but to the countless others moving through the world, each carrying their own burdens, their own truths. He realized that karma wasn't just personal. It was shared, a web of choices that touched everyone. This understanding deepened when Elias volunteered at a local community center, teaching mindfulness to people navigating their own struggles, parents, students, retirees, each with their own stories of loss and hope. He shared the Buddha's parable of the mustard seed, about a woman who, grieving her child, was asked to find a house untouched by loss. She returned empty-handed, realizing that suffering was universal, but so was compassion. Elias saw this truth reflected in the faces around him, and their courage to keep going despite their pain. He didn't teach as an expert, but as a fellow traveler, offering what he had learned on his own path. As months passed, Elias's life didn't become free of challenges. There were still long days at work, moments of doubt, relationships that tested his patience. But he approached them differently, with a gentleness born of seeing how his truths shaped his reality. He remembered a saying, "The mind is everything. What you think, you become." By choosing thoughts rooted in kindness and awareness, he was shaping a life that felt more aligned, more alive. Karma, he understood, was not a trap to escape, but a mirror, reflecting the choices he made each day. One evening, back on his balcony, Elias looked out at the city, its lights pulsing like a heartbeat. He felt a deep peace, not because he had all the answers, but because he was learning to ask better questions. The stars above seemed to echo the Buddha's words, "You, yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." Elias smiled, knowing the journey was far from over, but grateful for the steps he had taken. Each moment, each choice was a chance to live more fully, to weave a life of meaning, one truth at a time,